Welcome back to FreedoniaCon 2025. You have just joined in as we are about to start Cockneys versus Cowboys. British Joel and myself will, I guess, compare, contrast, give you the lowdown.
I think that's reasonable. I think we're doing to, shall we say, iconic, potentially lower class major concept, but yeah, separated by continents.
Well, and I think
And
that's one of the things I was going to say is a lot of people I don't think realize just how much the time frame is that it's the exact same time frame. You can have a samurai, you can have a pirate, you can have a gunslinger, and you can have a Victorian gentleman having his tea. And it's literally all the same time period. So let's see. I'm going to got this up on my screen right now. So I think it's a little easier as far as place for you, Joel, but I think a lot of people get a
yeah.
little confused with where the Wild West is. So I don't know that you can see this. Let me see if I can copy my image out of here. Let's see if that works so that I can show it to you on the main room for everybody. I don't know that it did it. Okay, 1 second. Let me see if I can move this really quick. All right. It is not letting me do it. That's ticking me off. Let's try this way. Nope. Well, fine. That's fine. I can just put it over here and you can't see it, but I can see it and anybody watching the video can see it. So in the Wild West, you have Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming. And weirdly enough, a lot of people don't realize that Chicago was a huge part of the Wild West because a lot of your cattle ranchers, when they were driving their cattle, a lot of times the cattle would end up in Chicago because Chicago was like probably one of the most important cities in the U.S. at the time.
I understand it as a grand tradition of meat packing and an awful lot
Which
because of the Great Lakes, as I understand it.
yeah, and that's the meat packing and all that ties into that Wild West thing. So, like I said, I figure you have an easier time because everyone knows Victorian. It's England. It's the UK. Whereas the Wild
I am going to
West,
say
I've had people who honestly think the Wild West starts at like New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona and those. I'm like, oh no, it starts much further east. It's a lot of just past the Mississippi.
I would point out that the definition of Cockney is something quite particular.
That is true. Can you explain that part?
I'm dropping a map in the chat because it's a useful map. So Cockney is not just lower class London. It's a very specific area of London defined by one of those gloriously, I think the Fae may have been involved in this. It is anyone born within the town of Bow Bells. So the Bow Bells are the bells of St Mary Le Bow Church, which is on Cheapside, which is one of the main roads that runs through London, not all that far from St Paul's Cathedral in the City of London, over towards more scurrilous areas like Soho and the Rookery of St Giles, but yeah, it gets a mention in Knight's Tale. It keeps being there for a long time, and Mary LeBeau Street
Okay.
is a church there. It has a bell.
So
Um,
is it just the blue area or is it the green and the blue?
the blue area would be, roughly speaking, where you could hear the bow bells nowadays, because there's a lot more tall buildings and a lot more noise. On a good day with the wind in your favour, the green area is representing much more what you'd have been able to cover in the years of ages of nine. Specifically, that has it listed as estimation of 1851, which
Gotcha.
essentially does make it the vast majority of East End London. You know, Shoreditch is and Whitechapel. You know, they pop up in Holmes and obviously Jack the Ripper, Tower Hamlets, Hackney. You are looking at this is the East End. The extent of that is going out to points where you're starting to run out of city in the 1880s. And the docks. Area, but it's also very specific. And a very strange thing. I do have a friend, one of my regular 1879 players, who, as well as being incredibly useful because she's old enough that she grew up with old money, so the pound, shilling, and pence thing she can literally do in her head. Um, is also actually a Cockney because she was born somewhere in that area and admittedly moved away when she was 2 and did steadfastly, despite my very polite request, refuse to show up as a show and tell. So I can't point to you out to a real life Cockney. Not that she sounds like one. Obviously, one of the big things people remember with Cockneys is the Cockney rhyming slang, which is apples and pears for stairs. I have a whole guide of it, though it is something of a living language in that some of it's actually quite modern references. Even I said Northern Londoner, consider sometimes refer to things having gone a bit Pete Tong, which is rhyming slang for wrong, named after a 90s dance DJ. I'm not sure why. And there's lots of things that vary and change over time, but some of their older. I'll be probably dropping lots of useful links in here. But essentially, it is a rhyming slang, like any slang is, to keep people out, so you know who belongs. People who are from elsewhere don't understand what you're saying, and then you can spot them more easily. So anytime a role-playing game references things like Thieves' Cant and that sort of language, even D&D's madness of alignment languages is a lot of it's a reference to the way that people use local slangs.
See,
That's me
no.
wandering off the point of definition of Cockneys. But yeah, so
So,
Cockney is essentially speaking
go ahead.
and usually working class. But it does have a specific definition, so that some people don't get to count.
So, since we're talking about slang now, this is a great for Western slang. The interesting thing I found as I was going through it, and I was like, I'm going to pick out some cool ones. And I realized how much of the Western slang is still used in the area that I live in. I don't know if you have the same with Cockney slang, but um, addle-headed, we still use that. Afeared, people still use that. A lick and a
Yep.
promise, all down but nine. There's a lot of them that a twixt in between. Um, there's a ton of these that are still used. Bamboozle, bellyache, of course. Be in your bonnet, going on a bender. Um, bilk to cheek. So like a lot of the slang is actually still used in my area. So what about with Cockney? Is a lot of
Yeah.
that slang still there from Victorian
It,
time?
look, yeah, I think it is. As I said, it has that issue that it's not a culture that has gone away. So we have modern ones, but ducking and diving. There's duck and dive, which means hiding. Um, but people will talk about ducking and diving as it's sort of wheeling dealing, possibly doing something dodgy. So I need to hide at a moment, notice. Um, there's one which I know, once a week beak, which is a name for a magistrate who refer to once a week because you saw them once a week, usually after payday and getting very drunk on a Saturday night and being locked up for the night.
See, now that sounds like the Wild West. Get a little drunk, have a little fun, spend a little time.
Working class people, working class people trying to have fun. Um, I'm just running through that list. There was a there's a bunch of them to.
There's even a term for it. Let me see if I can find it. Because I remember when I was brushing up on stuff, there was a term, and it wasn't even considered bad behavior. You would, before you left a town, you would, like shoot your guns up in the air, and there you go. When leaving a town after a weekend of carousing, it's perfectly all right to shoot your six gun into the air, whoop like crazy, and ride your horse as fast as you can. This was called hurrahing a town. So it was kind of like a thanks for the weekend. Ta-da!
Well, life's a bit of chaos and letting people know you've left so they can be happy, I suspect.
Well, I guess it depends on how much carousing and drunkard behavior you had going.
Indeed.
Because, yeah, no, it was always very interesting in the Wild West with this type of thing because part of it was considered normal. You worked hard moving the cattle or on your mine trying to pan for gold or whatever you're doing, and then you would spend your money in town. Town needs that money, so they're happy to have you. But there were points where people went too far, and then you get into some of the problems that they had with let's call it policing,
Yeah,
which I don't really feel like Cockney British had the problems that the Wild West had. I think it's just not possible for you guys to have had it.
I think a lot of the differences in the Wild West, you are looking at, your cowboys, you're looking at, they're a nomadic population, whereas your Cockneys, as it were, are more settled. But, looking at the areas and,
So it's
a lot of
so
them are dock workers.
size wise,
What's that
what
say?
the UK would fit inside Missouri, something like
Yes.
that. So think about the list of states I ran off, and
Yeah.
then we have this big problem with all the space and all the space in between, making it kind of hard to have a kind of easy area of this is my space, right? And
Yeah.
then you ran into problems with who's on first, who's in charge. Is the sheriff in charge or the marshal? What about the US marshal? What about the deputy? Where does my patrol area end and yours pick up? Um
Yeah.
Again, because of how the UK is set, maybe you could have gotten away with some of this, like if you caused a crime in Wales, if you went into England, could they still chase you?
Yeah. Yeah, to a degree, and I think some is there
So, like in
in
the Wild
London. Obviously,
West, the answer was no. If you crossed a state line, they basically were like, well, damn, I guess that's
yeah,
done for right now. So,
I think you might get away with things like that on mainland Europe to a degree, but
but
it's
not
all a
in
little
England.
closer. Obviously, in London, what you're looking at is you've got a lot of we're talking a time period where the population of London was, I think, sort of 3 million towards the end of our sort of Victorian time period. It's a huge place.
Oh, yeah,
So you're not
London's crazy.
disappearing into the wilds and crossing a state line. You're disappearing into areas where they can't find you because there's too many people to
I was gonna.
search.
So it's more like it's very representative of Andy's games that she thinks about how the logistics works when someone commits a crime. It,
Yes, yeah,
yeah. So when you run into things like they're hiding literally kind of in plain sight. There's a sea of people versus in the Wild West where it's a sea of nothing. And then
yeah,
you run into let's call it societal rules. In the
yeah,
Wild West, it was actually very not okay to ask about people's history. A
yeah,
lot of people they went west to get away from who they were before. So you and I had talked a little bit about multiculturalism. One of
yes,
those
yeah,
groups was actually, Black Americans, some of which used to be slaves, some of which were buffalo soldiers, some of them were leaving the east, the north, the south for a multitude of reasons. And it's a little weird in the fact that a lot of people think of cowboys as white guys on horses when a quarter to a third were probably black, and then you still have another large group that are like Mexican American.
yeah. From the point of view of sort of multiculturalism in the Cockney area, because it's defined where you're born. So, you know, you're not talking. You can't move to it and become a Cockney, but essentially speaking, by the rules, your children are. And the East End of London has a long history of being essentially where people move who are coming to London from foreign parts come to. So
So,
the common trade, as well as dock workers, is the rag trade, which sew clothing, a certain amount of making new clothing, but an awful lot of recycling clothing. And the rag trade and the traditional people who work in it were at one point Jewish immigrants chased out of other places in Europe, and the Huguenots, who were French Protestants chased out by the Catholics. Um, and then they've been followed in more recent times by black African, well, I suppose you call them African American black people of African origin and
so,
Caribbean origin
so
from
they would
British
be
colonies.
black Englishmen.
Black Englishmen, yeah,
Yes. So also
eventually
for
naturalized, and
the Wild West, we also have your Asian population that moved in with the trains. We
yeah,
still have the Native American population,
yeah,
right? And then you have some other interesting things with there was small Jewish populations that moved. Let's not go into the Mormons, but that's a whole thing too, which maybe we'll
yeah.
talk about at some point. But it's a whole thing.
They need
Um,
an episode of their own.
the Mormons were an interesting group. So in the state of Missouri, you actually could shoot a person because they were Mormon and on your property because there were issues. So it's a whole thing. Um, and then you had women, and women were a very odd because there weren't enough women out west, especially
Yeah,
what they would consider respectable women. So things get very blurry because of that, and I'll come back to it. But so yeah, as far as
yeah,
multiculturalism, you name it, it was here in the Wild West.
yeah. And to a great degree, the area that covered by Cockney is essentially it's where newcomers come to. Just peering at that map I've posted, Limehouse was, while they eventually moved further west, actually over towards Soho, which is current Chinatown, which is outside of being Cockney. Limehouse is where a lot of the initial East Asian Chinese and other areas came to. And I say there's a certain level of just people coming to the country get dumped into Shoreditch, Whitechapel, Limehouse, Bethnal Green, which is actually mostly, I believe, a Jewish neighbourhood, at least in tradition. And there, Tower Hamlets is one of those places that pops up on the news as that sort of a place of racial related unrest because it's very mixed neighborhoods. And it still is, and it always will be. And then as people become respectable, they move west and head into Islington and other areas, and it's part of the
And I
natural
think,
progression of Londoners. And
and I,
eventually,
and I think that that's
you
one of
come
the
to the
things that's
country, your children are
interesting.
Cockneys, and if you're successful, your grandchildren aren't because you moved to better parts of town.
So the Wild West, what you were before, you're not supposed to ask about. You're supposed to take
Yeah,
people as they are right here, right now. And so you lost a lot of your history on purpose, and you're starting
yeah,
over, and everybody's starting over. But this level of respectability becomes very fuzzy across the board all over. A lady who
yeah,
maybe was working as we're going to get demonetized no matter what I say here, um, as a brothel worker, right?
yep,
Might marry a guy and become technically respectable as someone's wife because there was
it's
a
yeah,
shortage of women. So you did see a lot of that. You saw a lot of women coming off of the reservations and being married. And I will be honest with you because it gets a little funny. There's at least one of the wives that's like my great great grandmother who's there are pictures of her. She apparently came off of a reservation. I don't know that she spoke English.
yeah,
So there's some questions sometimes about how some of these people became wives.
yeah,
The joke in the family is apparently if it doesn't run too fast, it could be a wife. I mean, um, it's a bad joke, I know.
yeah,
But there
I-
was a lot of that. And when you look at the law,
yeah,
whether which side of the tin star you were on was also questionable. There are a lot of people who started out as outlaws and then became like sheriffs and things like that, and there are people who were sheriffs that became outlaws, and
yeah.
sometimes they changed more than once. So you found that this idea of respectability was very fluid in the West. And I don't know that in England you had that same fluidity. It seems
You
a little
don't have the
more
same for it. Again,
structured. Rich, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, you're very much dealing with people who are the lower class, and they can move up, and it's a progression.
But I feel
Probably
like
not
it's
of
a very
lifetime.
slow progression for Victorian, and maybe I just have the wrong impression.
It is. I think it is. I sort of jokingly say when defining class, you're not defined by your class. You're defined by the class your parents achieved. So people can move up in the world, but you always look down on people who are new money. Oh, yeah.
And in the
Speaking from
West,
the top
pretty
social
much
classes, you know.
in the Wild West, everybody's new money because there was
Yeah.
no old money or very little. You did have
Yes.
like
Yeah.
the trained people coming in, and they would have been like an old money type of thing. But for the
Which of
most
course is
part,
part.
it was a by your bootstraps and you made you're self-made human.
Yeah, it's part of the attraction, and I suspect if we looked at it, we would find a number of Cockneys who ended up as cowboys.
That would not be uncommon. Um,
You certainly, I think, okay, I'm stretching back to that deep, perfect historical document, Young Guns, but that's talking, you're talking about people who are Irish
uh,
extraction and, from the bad areas of New York going out trying to make a life for themselves. And people will have gone
which
further than that
so
because you hear the stories.
so there was
And it's such
American
danger, and
history.
that's not something you get in Britain to the same
You
degree.
had a lot of Irish immigrants that left Ireland in poverty, whether they wanted to leave or not was questionable sometimes. Sometimes the British government would just box up these people and say, "You're paupers, go there." Like, they did. It's a
Yeah,
thing. Okay. And they would find themselves in the Eastern North America, Pennsylvania, New York, those areas, working these horrible jobs where they were never getting anywhere. And they were never
yeah,
going to because they were very looked down upon. I mean, in a lot of ways, there was a lot of Irish that might as well have been slaves because of how the deals were ran with indentured servitude. Okay. And they would go west. Sometimes they hadn't paid
Yeah,
all their bills, which is part of why you didn't ask. But they would go
yeah.
west looking to find something better. So, yeah, no, you absolutely would be able to find
But
probably a few
to
Cockneys in the mix.
give an example, actually, just checking my source and locations, it is counting as Cockney just about. Um, one of the biggest supermarket chains in the UK is a company called Sainsbury's, and they're not the poshest of posh supermarkets, but their current advertising is, "Ooh, we're going to Sainsbury's. Are we made of money?" And pointing out that they're not actually that much more expensive than anywhere else. Um, they're considered at the premium end of the brands, but Sainsbury's was started up by somebody who was living in Holborn, which is just about in the western corner of the Cockney area, as a shop that he opened as a retail shop. So, the chances are they'd come into a lot of money, they spotted a thing, and they're trying to make a name for themselves. And that was in 1869. They had a grocery shop, which they gradually turned into over the family still owns it,
But now they're
and
not Cockneys because they moved out.
because they've moved out and they've gone back. Well, and there is, as I said, there's a certain level of you arrive in the country, you take up a trade, you become successful, you open a store to sell that trade, and you gradually move out, and each generation gets a bit more money and a bit more money. And yeah, looking at that, Sainsbury's, it's sort of over 150 years have gone from, Lord, they've gone from people who were opening in a rough area of town, a grocer's shop, to people who are sitting in the House of Lords making decisions about the country. And so there is mobility. It's just
It's just much
generational,
slower.
I
It's
guess,
generational. It's much slower. Whereas
and
literally
much
the
slower.
Wild West was you could go out there with nothing and become a cattle baron. It
Yeah.
happened. And the rules were very quasi. Things like I've staked out this land, it's my land. It's very American. I have mushroom stamped this, it is mine. And the truth is as long as you could defend your space during this time period, it was yours. Like that
Yeah.
actually is how that worked. There was a lot of the like land runs and things like that. You would find a spot of land and go, nobody else is here. I claim this in the name of myself, and you would start your ranch. And if you
Yeah.
could defend it, it was yours. But we had in the US and this expansion so much land. Like it's
Yes. Yeah.
insane when you start thinking about how much just open land. And that becomes questionable because of the Native Americans and all of that. But the idea of I'm just going to can you imagine even in Victorian England someone just saying I claim this block and I have a gun and I'll shoot you if you touch my block. And people just going, well, I guess it's their block now.
No, we call those gangs, and we look at areas like Whitechapel, which essentially is a rookery, an area of bad place where the police wouldn't go, so people could claim do that sort of thing there,
But
but
these weren't considered
that
criminals. This was considered good American, elbow grease, tough work, go get it, tiger.
I'm not going to be drawn on respectability and criminality and the differences between Europe and America.
Well,
But yeah,
look, you're talking to the person who probably is the only one in the room who owns a cannon. I'm as American as we come. But I think that it's interesting because we're talking about that respectability type of thing. If you look
yeah,
at, and I think I shared a document with you where I was looking through some etiquette rules. If you look at some of the general etiquette, it should look very familiar because it was actually taken from British
Yes.
sources. A lot
Yep.
of that, and you'll see on the East Coast, a lot closer to those British ideals of manners. The further
Yes.
west you
Yeah.
get, the more that drifts from that. Um, like wearing gloves all the time, right?
Yep.
Very much just as British comes.
Yes, but equally, I suspect if you look at when you're dealing with the Cockneys, the further you get from the further down in society you get, the less the rules are applied. Because among other things, you can't afford gloves.
Right.
But again, it's that I suppose that sort of
Basic
it's
rules for
another way of
everyone.
spotting the people who don't belong because obviously she's working. She's from lower class and doesn't know about these things or can't afford gloves and.
So here you go. Basic rules for everyone. And I'm going to read it off and then you tell me whether it's also a Cockney rule.
Yep.
Stand up when being introduced or when an elderly person or dignitary enters the room.
I would say yes.
I would say yes too. Remember that silence is golden.
I think so, yes. Possibly because
This one
stitches
may
get
not
stitches.
be, but we'll see.
Stitches get
Because
stitches. That's what.
speak gently and graciously, no matter your true feelings. Assume the best in any situation. Practice the art of conversation.
I suspect that probably comes in as you move up the social classes. Once you start owning a shop, you start behaving like that.
See, I would say that this is definitely more Eastern and more wealthy than most of.
Yeah,
Yeah. Stand and sit
and I said in
properly.
London,
Good posture is essential.
yeah, I think definitely it happens, but I think also it is very much, like all of these rules that they sort of move. The, your average working class Cockney would be notable as not being as proper as some on that front.
So I highlighted this one because I had an 1879 table that did a deep dive in whether or not we were supposed to wear our gloves at the fancy ball when it was time to eat.
Yep.
And the answer was yes, no, probably.
Yeah, if you're eating, take your gloves off or undo
Actually,
them
it
at the.
depended.
Yeah.
Depended on how high level, it depended on what time period during the Victorian. There was actually
Yeah.
a lot of rules to whether or not you could take your gloves off even if you were eating. It depended on what you were eating. If you're eating stuff that you didn't use your hands for, you're more likely to need to be in gloves. So like if you're going to have a fork or a
Yes.
spoon,
And they.
but if it was
Yeah, and
something
they
you
had.
touched, then that was different.
I've seen ladies' long gloves that have little sets of buttons near the wrist, so you could unbutton them,
Mhm.
take them off to uncover your fingers,
Yep. And then put them
so
back.
you could eat and not do that. And it's
So this one was remove your gloves when making a formal visit. So I would say that that's almost complete opposite of everything I know about British. The more formal, the more
yes,
likely you are to wear gloves.
yeah, indeed. I think
So
it comes down
I
to it.
thought that one
The
was
chances
weird.
are, for a lot of cowboys and a lot of Cockneys, your gloves are probably things you're wearing for working.
The other
So
big
a certain
one,
degree of taking your gloves off to meet somebody and taking your gloves off so you can shake hands with them properly is also going. I'm not going to get.
so most of your cowboys didn't wear
Oh, yeah.
gloves unless they were working. You used them to work.
Yeah,
You weren't wearing them in the
I
saloon
suspect the same is true
in
for an awful lot of
town.
Cockneys
Yeah. So
because gloves are expensive. Yeah, Sunday it might be different. You're going somewhere posh, you'd have a set of gloves for being posh in. But day to day, gloves are expensive and require a specialist person to make, so you're not going to wear them because you don't want to get your fancy stuff dirty.
let's see.
But heavy leather work gloves, different matter if you're moving stuff on the docks.
So now these are more specifically cowboy etiquette rules.
Yeah.
Don't inquire into a person's past. Take the measure of the man of what he is today. What would you say about Cockney? Because you're talking about a lot of new people immigrating in.
I, I suspect, not digging into someone's past is a thing. You know, you are talking about an area where you're going to get new people to do that. So I suspect there may have been some of that. You know, particularly in the rougher an area gets, the more you just see who the person is.
All right.
And
This
don't ask around. But equally, because yeah, in a lot of cases, because we're talking generations of immigration,
all
people
right.
are more familiar with each other, so you're not meeting quite as many new people all the time.
Defend yourself whenever necessary, but don't make a threat without expecting dire consequences. This is easily don't want none, don't start none. Just saying.
Yeah, I think that would also be true. You know, particularly if we're dealing with the very rough and ready. It's
All right.
you don't start things, you finish fights.
Never
Um,
order anything weaker than whiskey, and always fill your whiskey glass to the brim.
I suspect the whiskey is mostly limited to the Scots and the Irish immigrants living in the area. You know, we're talking more bathtub
I
gin.
see. I believe that even in Cockney, that a man could order tea and no one would look at him funny.
I think so in the right places, but in an awful lot of bars and places, you order gin and you hope it's not the sort that leaves you blind. Um,
Well, that's always a good
because
thing
gin
to
is
hope
great
for.
for covering up terrible alcohol.
All right. Let's see. Never pass anyone on the trail without saying howdy.
And again, you greet people, you say good day, you give them a good day, you tip your hat to them.
I will say that, and you can correct me, but from what I know and from what I've talked to other people, especially Midwest, what was the Wild West, Americans are always absolutely more outgoingly friendly. British are not as, we just see people, we say hi, we mean it, we talk to them. So I would say
I,
that this is definitely more of an Americanism. And
I
I think it's
think,
part of why you've been out to the Midwest, but you were up in like Chicago, which is a bigger city, not quite the same. I think you'd be very surprised at going to Joplin and going into a Walmart
yeah,
at how friendly. There was actually a couple of guys, they were traveling in an RV on
yeah.
what's 66, which goes from like Chicago to LA or something like that. And
Where Route 66, it has a song and everything.
they it does. Um and they were very nervous because they wanted to ask someone because they weren't sure what size bed sheets they needed.
Yeah,
And they're just like, oh, because it didn't matter who they talked to. Most, especially Midwestern Americans, are exceptionally friendly and easygoing with new people.
yeah,
So I would say that, but there's even more rules about this saying hi because like when you're approaching someone from behind, you want to like greet them so that they don't shoot you and think that you're sneaking up on them.
yeah.
Um, you don't wave at a man's horse, but this one might be everywhere because horses apparently spook really easy. So you're
Horses are
supposed
like living explosives.
so you're supposed to nod a greeting, but you don't wave or
Yeah,
spook the horse.
that seems like, most people won't have horses, but I think, it's British Reserve is an odd thing. I would say, in my experience, chunks of London, you will wander in, and the people are actually very friendly and will talk to you. And there is a certain dramatic stereotype of the friendly, chatty Cockney, and I
Oh,
think it's quite true. That's you
they're the
go to
most
West
friendly of the
London as well.
Brits. They're the most friendly of the
They're the
Brits.
most friendly of Londoners. But then I think it's actually a sort of politely not prying into people is one of those things of the middle class, um, of which there's an awful lot of middle class in Britain these days, and that sort of reserve. Whereas friendly, how you doing, how's your day going, making small talk tends to be more of a and paying attention, because in the Wild West, if you don't live with near somebody, you can ride off in another direction. In East London, you just don't have that option
No.
because well, you're going to live next to somebody.
That's true.
So knowing people's, but you don't pry, you don't dig, but also knowing people's business and chatting to them and being friendly is a thing. And yeah, I regularly joke as a northern British person that in London it's illegal to talk to people, and London needs biscuits because they don't talk to people. But I would say it's not entirely true in the East End, as it were. There are a lot, the tradition is a lot more, not prying as such, but a lot more friendly, a lot more chatty, and there's a sort of the London taxi driver who talks your ear off
All right.
is a thing, and he's built on the stereotype of a friendly, outgoing,
So I've got one.
East Londoner, and one that you will regularly meet and have a time of potentially awkward silence with, so they will fill the air.
All right. So I got one for you to compare. And we'll
Yep.
see. Because there were horses in London in Victorian era.
Well, yeah.
So in the Wild West, a horse thief may be hung preemptively. So literally, the way that the laws were written is basically if we thought you were horse rustling, we didn't wait till you actually took the horse. They would just shoot you. If you were caught cattle rustling or horse rustling, you were usually hung. What makes it even more interesting is a lot of Western states still have basically those rules, or pretty much those rules, on the books to this day. Like, it is still technically a capital offense to be a horse rustler. I don't think that we've actually killed anybody for it lately, but I believe that a lot of the states still have it on the books. What happened in Victorian era to horse wrestlers, or how did that work?
I'm not sure horse wrestling was a major issue in London, though, stealing a cabbie's horse is stealing a man's livelihood, so I can't imagine it would go down well. And cabbies are not soft people, and they all know each other. So finding out you've nicked someone's livelihood is probably going to get you very short shrift. I can't say it's something I have a lot of information on, and if you get caught at it, you could get hung for it, or worse, you could be sent to Australia.
That's always an option. That is something that we did not do. We did not send people to other countries like that. You just ran away. You just changed your name. Yeah. You send them to us, and then they change their names, and they just go further west. They would reinvent themselves.
Was at least as common as transportation as Australia, and is found. Though I would say, as an aside to link the Australians across, an awful lot of people who played Cockneys in early 40s, 50s, 60s American cinema, Hollywood cinema, it was a common role given to Australians because the Australian accent sounds enough like that chunk of working class London.
What I was going to say is things like I'm sure you've heard of at least H.H. Holmes.
Yeah.
That's his like fourth or fifth name. Because what would happen is that it was actually very common for con artists, snake oil salesmen, and things like that to literally just change their name and go 3 towns over, or cross a county line or a state line. I do know that just like we had snake oil salesmen, England Cockney would also in that time period had people who were ill-behaved in selling cocaine and laudanum at best, and fire water at worst, claiming it cured everything.
And people claiming exotic pests to sell medical quackery type stuff. It's a literary trope. It's definitely happened, and a certain
it happened a lot.
It happened a lot.
I was telling a story.
Exotic heritage to hide their other background is definitely.
So I was telling there's a guy, bad man named Big Nose George, and
Yep.
we'll skip ahead, but after he was lynched, well, he got caught, he ran away, he crossed the state line. They finally got him back. They apparently the people weren't going to wait around for the judge. So he gets lynched. The judge gives the body over to a quote doctor scientist guy. Because this is in the time period where people thought things like the bumps on your head might say if you're a good or bad person. This guy
Yep.
was more advanced than that. He thought that by looking at your brain, you could tell if you were a good or a bad person. So he
Yep.
wanted to study Nose George's brain, and he convinced this judge to let him have the body because nobody else wanted it. So they didn't want to pay to, you know, bury it. So they gave it to the scientist. Now, horrible things happened after that, by the way. Like the top of his head was used as an ashtray. His face was turned into a death mask. Part of his body was basically skinned and tanned and turned into shoes and a doctor's bag. It's a whole thing. In the name, and partially in the name of science.
Yep.
Can you imagine in this day and age walking up and being like, Judge, nobody wants that dude's body. Why don't you just let me have it for science?
Yeah. On that note, Londoners, I think British people in general, have a grand, particularly look at it. Yeah, there's a twofold issue with death. Is that one medical practice is bad enough that somebody might be declared dead and might be still alive, just in a comatose state. So there was a very real fear of being buried alive. So there are traditions about how long you observe the corpse for.
Yeah, that's actually in the same time period here. It was common to view the body for like 3 days, sometimes longer.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other trick used to be, and it's less out in the Wild West, more out on like the East Coast, Louisiana, maybe England. Yep. They would have a string with a bell.
Yeah, string with a bell that comes up. So
Yep.
Basically, part of the construction of the coffin, you could ring it just in case you were alive. And then you have the second stage. If they actually are dead, you're worried about your loved ones being stolen by, I think,
body snatchers,
the sectionists, the body snatch. Burke and Hare, which were Edinburgh based rather than London, part of it. But you literally have things called coffin torpedoes, which are booby-trapped missiles that, if somebody tries to dig it up, will fire on them and blow them up. Automatic guns, there's a whole load of weird madness. Let's see if I can find something in the coffin torpedoes.
So it's a common enough thing out in the Wild West, out this direction, that so my great uncle would be, oh goodness. Really, in truth, he was born shortly after Victorian period, but not by a lot.
Resurrectionists, that's the term.
And
that's the term for
he
them.
was so worried about people stealing from his wife's body that she was entombed in concrete. So
yeah,
it was a thing out here too. And depending on what area and things like that, that was a whole thing. There was a lot of bodies that were stolen for science. England had this problem as well. Sometimes they would just kill people and sell the body for science, but that wasn't as big of a problem out here, because where were you selling it out here? There weren't as many schools to sell to, so you didn't have nearly as much. You did have things like, so there's it's a family tale. So everybody on my dad's side, which I'm pretty sure they were kicked out of England, Scotland for petty crimes, pretty sure of it. But they basically were all petty thieves or Baptist ministers, sometimes both. Okay. Yeah. Like we had.
What's the difference? Sorry.
We had some family members that were associates with the Daltons Bellstar is actually a cousin by, I think, by marriage. So the family tree is a little sketchy, and they actually, it was
Yeah.
interesting trying to learn anything because they would lie. They lied about where they were born. They lied about the year. They would lie about their names. Like
Yeah.
even so, I have a great aunt. So again, she would be coming just right off of this Victorian era, and she was married something like 10, 12 times, but there was only like 2
Yeah.
divorces and 3 deaths. So you do the math.
Yeah.
She would literally just be sick of a guy, sick of him as a husband, pack up, take the kids, and leave and marry somebody else. She
Yeah.
lied about her name, and this is what she also would move her oxygen over in her old age to smoke her cigars. Don't mess with Great Aunt Lucille, right? But there was a story of one of the ones, and I guess that he was referred to as the deacon. And basically, there was some fight in the church, and the deacon asked him to step outside. The guy stepped outside expecting a fight. The deacon just shot him. That was the end of that. And there really wasn't a criminal investigation, which you would think modernly you can't just do that, right?
Yeah.
But in this time period, that man was starting a fight in the church, and that ain't right. There were
Yeah.
a lot of stuff that would be what was only natural. You were going to get shot for doing that, and people didn't look. And then, like I said, you had jurisdiction issues. It was really
Yeah.
a little laissez-faire.
Yeah. Law enforcement is such a weirdly modern concept, or what we think of as law enforcement.
Yes.
You know, the police didn't start up, you know, Metropolitan Police in London are 1830s. Okay, you did have people enforcing the laws, but it's much more you bring a case before a magistrate that this person has committed a crime against you.
And those laws were
The
actually
idea
still
of people who
evolving.
are employed to bring criminals to justice in general, rather than something that's more akin to bounty hunters, is a startlingly new concept.
So, I mean, we've had this for 1879. The idea that the police are going to look into your crime, not necessarily so true. That they're going to
Yeah,
involve themselves in a dangerous situation, not necessarily so true. And it was worse in the Wild West. I mean,
yes, yeah,
one of the things other than jurisdiction that was a major problem was payment for law enforcement
yeah,
in the Wild West.
yeah,
A lot of times they made their money off of bounties and off
yeah,
of get my cattle back and I will give you X reward. Well, if I'm making my money off of the reward for finding the stolen items, I'm not necessarily out to stop the criminal because if he quits stealing, I don't get rewards for finding the
yeah.
stuff. So,
Bring the stuff back. Don't worry about the criminal. Yeah,
right. And so this actually was a thing. And it made some of them maybe less. I mean, here's the thing. If there was a bounty on my head and you're going to get $10, right? If I paid you $15 to look the other way, a lot of them would. I give you
yeah.
$11. Go away. Okay.
That,
So,
well, yeah. Essentially, there's people involved in the Bow Street Runners who were essentially running fencing operations. You know, you get arrested for stealing, you pay them off. But you know, if you want to know, you know, if you wanted something stealing particularly, you there.
oh,
And a certain amount of, you know, oh, you didn't nick it with my purview, right? We'll take it off you, then sell it to the people who want it back.
exactly. Which would brought the
It's
rise of during this time period, it brought the rise of private investigations. So this is where you see the
yes, yeah,
Pinkertons and all of that starts up because well, police were new and didn't necessarily do what you wanted. So you would hire private individuals to go and do these things so that you maybe could take it to court or at least get your property back.
and you know, it's
And then the
you know,
Pinkertons go
in
too
Holmes, he
far.
talks about
Sorry, you're saying.
yeah, When in the Holmes, you're referencing lots of people who are paid detectives, who come and talk to Sherlock Holmes because he consults for them and solves their cases for them. Is the plot of that? But it's talking about a real thing of, yeah, like the Pinkertons,
Hmm. And England had their own
like
versions.
in the game you run for us. It's we are an investigative bureau doing that sort of thing, and it's a certain degree beginning to be involved with the police, with the police, but it's not just limited to them. Um,
I think Joel and I could probably talk about this for hours. I'm just gonna say that.
yeah,
But we have a few minutes left, Joel, and if you don't mind, I'm gonna see if anybody has any questions for either of us. Because I didn't even get into hats or superstitions. There's some cool superstitions.
I found some great ones.
What do you got?
I found some weird.
We'll see if anybody types up a
I think
question.
the best one I found out is there's a statue of, I believe it's Gladstone, the Prime Minister at the time, actually outside Mary Le Bow Church, of the Bow Bells, which the hands of which are red, because the person who paid for the statue paid for it by docking the wages of all the workers who worked for him.
Oh.
They like him so much they funded this statue, but it wasn't given an option, and he was taking the money off match girls, who were the people
Oh.
who were making the the
That's sucky.
stuff, the phosphorus. Yeah, but the hands turned red basically because people treated it something. Give me a moment. I'm going to try and track down find my link to it. I did. The red hands of William Gladstone. There we go. It is
So,
Road.
so one of
It's the
my
bride and maid match girls who basically were among the first successful, unionization type actions. The stuff that was up with them because of working with phosphorus is horrible. The match girl strike of 1888. But for whatever reason, the hands of the statue are permanently red. Probably because somebody treated it with something in the bronze that's not going away.
so my favorite Wild West, Old West, still actually in play a lot of times, but I don't know that people remember that this is where it came from. Um, and it's a joke in some parts over Gen Con with all my lovely people. So a couple of years ago at Gen Con, I asked if anybody had a knife. I'm as a lady, I don't carry a knife. It's very uncommon for women to carry knives, right? Still to this day. Not that it's completely, but it's uncommon. And nobody did. Ross didn't have a knife. Brad didn't have a pocket knife. And I'm like, what the Hades? Because I'm used to anytime I've ever asked for a knife, I've got five guys pulling out their pocket knives and clicking them open, right?
Just imagine Brad would carry something very complicated.
At least he would have a knife, right? So I actually
Yeah.
bought last year or the year before, I bought knives that now live with our Gen Con stuff because of this. But here's the part of the superstitions. So you could not give someone a knife as a gift. They had to pay you something for it, even if it was just a penny. Because if you just gave them a knife and they didn't give you a penny, it could be seen as you were cutting ties of your friendship. Kind of like a go F
Yeah.
yourself, here's a knife, right? The other part of it was that if someone hands you a knife unopened, you're supposed to close it. You hand it back to them in the way that it's handed to you.
Yeah.
So guys would typically hand a knife to another gentleman closed, right? But
Yep.
typically speaking, you never hand the knife to a lady closed and expect her to open it. You
Yeah.
always open it for her and then hand it to her so that she can do whatever she wants, or you just cut whatever she wants cut. And then the lady doesn't close the knife, she hands it back to you the same way that she was given it. It's ta-da. And you can't leave your cowboy hat on your bed, possibly because of lives, but mostly because you're inviting death. And gloom and doom.
Yeah.
This has been a lot of fun. I could talk this stuff with you forever, dude. But it's
Yeah.
5 o'clock, so I can't. I hope everybody had a good time.
That is great.
Joel, as always, you are super knowledgeable, and I adore doing stuff with you.
Always happy.
All right. I will be stopping the stream, and we will be starting the next event in a second or two.